So here we go. Becoming Led Zeppelin hits theaters this week, and it's going to be an IMAX experience. I can't wait to see this, as this is the first fully authorized Led Zeppelin documentary. Like, you might think you've seen Led Zeppelin docs, and you probably have. There are a few that are out there from over the years. Some take a comprehensive look at the band's career and history. Other documentaries are kind of those like classic albums where you go into just like the Untitled 4 album or Led Zeppelin 2 or Physical Graffiti. There are a few album specific like 30-minute to 45-minute docs. But this is the documentary where the members, the surviving members, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, and John Paul Jones have agreed that this is the time that feels right for them, in their own words, to tell their story. Now, Becoming Led Zeppelin is directed by Bernard McMahon, and through a series of conversations, he finally convinced Jimmy Page through the storyboard as he was kind of building the ideas around the documentary out. Through that storyboard, he got Jimmy Page on board with the creation and the release of this Becoming Led Zeppelin doc. And I want to ask you, what are you looking forward to through this documentary? Like, what do you want to see, or what do you want to understand, or what would you like explained that you haven't already gotten in any other form of Led Zeppelin media? Like the mythical legend that is Led Zeppelin, the story's been told, but we haven't gotten as many documentaries, for instance, as we do of the Beatles, right? Like, we've seen the comprehensive Beatles documentary, like the anthology doc, which I still consider to be the best Beatles documentary. And then, you know, throughout the years, we've got documentaries that zero in and focus on particular parts of the Beatles' career. We just got that Martin Scorsese produced Beatles 64. Just before that, we got Get Back. That was the Peter Jackson one, you know, when they were preparing for that rooftop concert and the Let It Be album. Just before that, we got the Ron Howard directed 8 Days a Week. So we've got our share of Beatles documentaries throughout the years. We've seen that story told in several different ways and at several different phases. But with Led Zeppelin, I feel like it's fewer and far between. I mean, if anything, I feel like their concert docs are more iconic than their actual documentaries, at least before this Becoming Led Zeppelin documentary. Like, my favorite is the one that just says Led Zeppelin. It's got the blue sky and the sand, right? The desert sand. I would, you know, pull that one out, but I have it packed away in a box as I'm preparing to move. But that one is a tremendous 4-part concert documentary where they have one very early Led Zeppelin concert, they've got 2 in their prime, and then they've got one towards the tail end of Led Zeppelin's career. And in terms of overall media, I feel like my favorite Led Zeppelin thing, besides their actual albums, right? Of course, that takes the cake. But this book written by Mark Blake, this is called Bring It On Home. This is the biography of Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin's famous and controversial manager. Like, this guy is basically Suge Knight before Suge Knight. This is a wild story. You can see I've got the bookmark. I'm actually in the process of rereading this one. If you want everything that has to do with the creation and throughout the career of Led Zeppelin from a very intimate behind the scenes take, and you know, you had Peter Grant, and with him you had like different entourages with this motley crew cast of like very seedy characters. Very interesting story. Like, Peter Grant, he was a pro wrestler before he became a music manager. He had a very interesting path, and he eventually found himself becoming the Yardbirds manager. So the Yardbirds is the genesis, the origin of Led Zeppelin, right? The Yardbirds at one point had Eric Clapton. After that, they had Jeff Beck. Now, when Jimmy Page eventually joined the band, he was actually replacing their bassist. Then he switched from bassist to guitar. And at that time, for a short period of time, the Yardbirds had both Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. So this was kind of late Yardbirds. And by this point, their vocalist Keith Relf and the drummer Jim McCarthy, they were kind of burnt out. So they started like a folky duo. And then Jimmy Page was pretty much tasked with reassembling or replacing members of the Yardbirds at that point, right? To keep the thing going. So Jimmy Page at that point wanted to create a supergroup. And at the time, he was planning for that supergroup to include him, Jeff Beck, and they would both be on guitars, as well as The Who's Keith Moon and John Entwistle, where you've got Keith Moon on the drums and Entwistle on the bass. And then they were testing out, you know, and trying out and interviewing different potential lead singers. I mean, they talked to everybody from Steve Winwood to Steve Marriott. Well, this group never came together, but in the process of planning the group, they recorded the song that became Beck's Bolero. That's one of the more iconic Jeff Beck, the late Jeff Beck, just passed away a couple years ago, Jeff Beck songs, which had Beck and Jimmy Page on guitar. And it also had, a lot of people don't know this, but it also had not only Keith Moon on the drums, but it also featured John Paul Jones, the bassist, keyboardist, who would later become a member of Led Zeppelin. So again, that supergroup that Jimmy Page was planning never came into fruition. So then he and Peter Grant, again, this was already Jimmy Page's manager, and Jimmy Page was pretty much Peter Grant's like favorite guy. Peter Grant would do anything for Jimmy Page, and therefore through the band, any band that Jimmy Page would be a part of. So they start assembling a new group that they for a time called the New Yardbirds. And Jimmy Page's first choice of vocalist was kind of a hotshot, Terry Reid, who actually turned the gig down. But Terry Reid also recommended another vocalist by the name of Robert Plant, who at the time had two other bands. One was called like Hobbs Tweedle, and the other one was Band of Joy, which was a name that after Led Zeppelin years later, I'm talking like the mid to late 2000s, Robert Plant would name an album, a solo album, Band of Joy, because that was the name of one of the two bands that Robert Plant was a part of before joining what would become Led Zeppelin. So when Robert Plant joined the band, he recommended to Jimmy Page and to Peter Grant that they also include his dear friend John Bonham, who was also a member of Band of Joy. And around the same time, John Paul Jones's wife recommended that he try and offer himself up to this newly constructed band. So they did so, and before you know it, you've got Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page on guitar, Robert Plant sometimes on harmonica, sometimes on tambourine, but always on vocals. You've got the late legendary John Bonham on the drums, and then John Paul Jones on bass and often keyboardists, especially in the second half of Led Zeppelin's career. You get a lot more keyboards. Think In the Light, the beginning of album 2 of the second part of Physical Graffiti, and several other songs. So that's just a little bit about the origin of Led Zeppelin. I'm just wondering how this documentary is going to cover that, because they're basically going to take you from the origins, right? So I'm wondering, are they going to get into how into Robert Plant's time with Hobbs Tweedle and Band of Joy before joining Led Zeppelin? Like, how much of that story is going to be told? How much of the the Yardbirds is going to be told? Are they going to cover the fact that like Little Games, right? That is the Yardbirds album that's got most of the Jimmy Page work while he was with the Yardbirds. That was their 1967 album. Actually, give some of that Yardbirds discography a listen if you haven't. There's some really good Yardbirds music that I feel floats under the radar. But I'm assuming that they're going to take you from those early origins to maybe up to Led Zeppelin 2 or 3, maybe 1969, 1970. Because, it's called Becoming Led Zeppelin, so I don't think they're going to go into the second half of the career. I don't think they're going to take you through 4 or Untitled, which will become pretty much widely recognized as the greatest Led Zeppelin album, the one with, Black Dog, Rock and Roll, Stairway to Heaven, When the Levee Breaks, Going to California, right? I don't think they're going to necessarily go through that portion of the career or Houses of the Holy, Physical Graffiti, or anything that followed. But just know that once John Bonham died of pulmonary aspiration, it's basically when you've got too much alcohol in your system and you end up vomiting and choking. And it happens, it actually happens a lot to a lot of people. There's nobody around them to discover them while they are choking, and they're later found dead, as was the case with John Bonham. Very tragic. But once he died in 1980, that was the end of Led Zeppelin. I know that they had like the Celebration Day concert, and they've popped up often with John Bonham's son on drums. But no, when John Bonham died, this was truly a band. I know a lot of bands replaced members and so forth, but no, Led Zeppelin came in with those 4 and they went out with those 4. The death of John Bonham was the end of Led Zeppelin. But yeah, I'm really curious how they're going to cover this, what kind of footage we're going to get. I mean, this is going to be an IMAX experience in the theater. So yeah, I can't wait to see how this thing is put together. I mean, you could tell I'm a Led Zeppelin fan, but I'm just overly excited that this is going to be again, fully authorized, where you're going to get interviews of the different members. And I wonder how much footage we're going to get of Peter Grant and him kind of executing some of his shenanigans. Like, remember they had that, what was it? The Song Remains the Same. It was a movie like that they shot late in their career. And you see a lot of kind of like odd scenery, and you see a lot of Peter Grant in that documentary. And it has different moments where there's some dialogue, a lot of costumes. And it was just a very interesting, it was a concert film with these weird cutaways, right? Kind of an odd film. But I wonder if they're going to have like a lot of like interview footage and just kind of behind the scenes footage of Peter Grant and some of his motley crew. I mean, you look up this entourage. He has everything from members of, you know, England's underworld to, you know, former actors, and some of the stuff that they, you know, reportedly and, you know, admittedly carried out. It was pretty wild, and Peter Green had a lot of strong arm tactics to make sure that the band got what they want. Again, if you're into reading, check out Bring It On Home, the biography on Peter Grant. Again, this is like my favorite non-musical thing related to Led Zeppelin. But yeah, if you have any other recommendations, biography or just, you know, book-wise on Led Zeppelin, let me know what your favorite might be. Also, let me know what your favorite up to this point, not including Becoming Led Zeppelin. Although if you have already seen this documentary, whether it was at like a festival or something, let me know. I know they had a couple premieres and stuff like that. Let me know what you thought of this documentary. But if you haven't seen it, let me know what your favorite Led Zeppelin film. It could be a concert film or one of the few documentaries, or Song Remains the Same. Let me know what your favorite Led Zeppelin film is. And again, let me know what you want to see or are curious about when it comes to Becoming Led Zeppelin in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.